Hi everyone, this is Hana. Today I want to talk about the war that the US and Israel are waging against Iran. In this age of AI, we can access endless information if we just try. In a world overflowing with information, I think the most important thing is what kind of questions are we asking? So today, based on the information I can access and the conversations I've had with friends all over the world, I want to share my own perspective and thoughts. It's completely okay if you don't agree with me. The world is full of different people. As long as we respect our differences, I believe we can have constructive debates and find better alternatives for our future. So, shall we begin? Around 2 a.m. on March 1st, a mass shooting happened in downtown Austin, Texas. A man driving a large SUV fired pistols and rifles at an outdoor bar patio and the street. Because of this horrific attack, 3 innocent US citizens died at the scene and 14 were heavily injured. The shooter was killed by the police. He was a 53-year-old Senegalese American citizen. He was wearing a shirt with the Iranian flag on it and a hoodie that said, "Property of Allah." A Quran was found in his car. The FBI immediately launched a massive investigation, treating it as a terror attack connected to the US bombing of Iran the day before. Currently, the FBI and the DHS have raised the terror alert to the highest level. They warn that extremists, whether directly by Iran or acting alone, could launch more attacks anywhere on US soil. From LA, which has a large Iranian population, to the heart of New York, the entire United States is trembling in fear of retaliation. The missiles that the US dropped on another country's sky have eventually returned as a boomerang. They have become a ticking time bomb seeping into the daily lives of Americans. But the loud voices expressing all this anger were completely silent about another massacre that happened just one day earlier in Iran. On the morning of February 28th local time, the US and Israel carried out so-called Operation Epic Fury. A precision missile hit a primary school in southern Iran. From the crushed concrete rubber, the bodies of 165 young girls aged 7 to 12 were found. 95 others were seriously injured. The UN, UNESCO, and human rights activists like Malala cried out in despair. They called it a clear violation of international humanitarian law and a horrific massacre of civilians. But Western media clearly hides the subject of this massive killing. Instead, they package it as unavoidable collateral damage and a legitimate act of defense by the great United States to defeat the absolute evil Iran. However, the horrifying reality on the ground cannot be covered up by any Western excuses. A few days later, excavators dug over 100 graves at once, and a joint funeral was held for those sacrificed little girls. What kind of threat did those children ever pose to America? Western media arrogantly frames the US bombings as something that will bring liberation to Iranian citizens. But behind the frame, the tragic survivor dilemma of ordinary Iranian people is completely hidden. Even the young people in Iran who recently lost friends to the bullets of their corrupt regime during anti-government protests are now expressing extreme fear and anger because innocent children are being sacrificed by the blind bombing of foreign powers. To them, American missiles are not salvation from oppression. They are just another form of blind slaughter. A single person's violence on US soil is labeled as terrorism that shakes national security. But state level violence attacking a sovereign nation against international law is called legitimate defense. This is the ultimate double standard. This is the story of deception that powerful nations have been writing for decades on the stage of global politics. Karma always calls for karma. When the US triggers an action that kills 165 of the most innocent children in the world with bombs, what did they expect from the reaction bullets flying right back at them? I grew up in South Korea in the 80s and 90s. For me, US-centric pop culture, Hollywood movies, and Western medias were almost the only windows I had to interpret the world. For a very long time, I believed this unbalanced and deceptive Western frame was the absolute truth. In the Hollywood movies that filled the screen of my childhood, the US military and the CIA were always the agonizing heroes protect world peace. And the Arabs in the Middle East were always portrayed as savage fanatics, charging in with a bomb vest filled with angry madness. I observed books written by white elite intellectuals as if they were a universal truth. And watching Korean politics, which copied the US system and ideology, I naturally became trapped in a giant matrix. The West is absolute good, and the Middle East is absolute evil. America despises what it does not understand. This is a line from the American TV show Homeland. Western imperialist countries never try to understand the long history and complex dilemmas of other nations. Because the moment they understand them, they have to treat them as equal human beings. And they would have to feel moral guilt for the children dying from the missiles they fire. So they intentionally downgrade the other side into irrational monsters and completely alienate them. Only then can they press the bomber button without a guilty conscience and smile as their defense stocks go up. The history of violence created by this imperial arrogance has been clearly manipulated in the public's mind. Many people believe that the 9/11 terror attacks in 2001 provided the justification for the illegal US invasion of Iraq in 2003. But the fact is actually the opposite. In the 1980s in Afghanistan, under the excuse of keeping the Soviet Union in check, the US handed weapons to Islamic extremist rebels. That greedy intervention eventually returned as the horrific boomerang of the 9/11 attacks by Al Qaeda. And using that 9/11 attack as an excuse, the US invaded Iraq and turned the Middle East into a wasteland. In that power vacuum, ISIS was born. And that led to the terror attack at the Bataclan Theater in Paris. Action creates reaction. And that reaction gives birth to even greater violence. It is a brutal, infinite loop of blood. In this massive cycle of violence, the Western media's framing hits the peak of hypocrisy. Why is Israel always the victim in Western media? The psychological and historical guilt of Western society regarding the Holocaust during World War II has become an iron war of unconditional support for Israel. In Western society, criticizing Israel's policy immediately brings back the scarlet letter of anti Semitism. This becomes the most powerful weapon to shut the mouths of politicians and the press. Israeli spokespersons give interviews in fluent English, actively leading the public opinion war. But the desperate cries of the Palestinians or Iranian people are rarely broadcasted properly. How much longer do we have to uncritically accept Israel's tyranny, which is fueled by the West's twisted guilt? Once, as a citizen of a country that suffered in World War II, I also felt deep sorrow for the painful history of the Jewish people. But historically, we Koreans owe nothing to the Jewish people. I think it is time for us to slowly break away from this biased worldview centered around Western media. Right now, we are witnessing the wheel of history spinning fiercely once again. Trump, Netanyahu, the late Khamenei, Putin, Xi Jinping. The world ruled by these old men in their 70s and 80s, a so-called gerontocracy, is more dangerous and cowardly than ever. They will not live long enough to take responsibility for the catastrophic result of their extreme decisions. They are just using a cowardly smokescreen to cover up their domestic political crisis and extend their power. They are burning the lives of innocent foreign citizens as a sacrifice for their wag the dog tactics. Wag the dog is a political term meaning the tail wags the dog. It refers to politicians intentionally creating an outside enemy and fabricating a massive security crisis like a war to distract the public's anger away from their own huge scandals. Just to protect their own power, they gladly sacrifice the actual dog, which is world peace and human rights. They are turning innocent people into scapegoats. This deception of Western powers were fully exposed in the joint statement released on the same day by the UK, Germany, and France. The US and Israel violated another country's sovereignty and massacred 165 young Iranian schoolgirls. It was a clear preemptive strike, violating international law. But these three countries did not say a single word of criticism or regret about it. They only criticized Iran's defensive attack, which happened after Iran was bombed without warning during nuclear negotiation. Let's look at how the European leaders who claim to protect peace and international law are actually showing completely hypocritical and self-centered behaviors. First, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer's actions were the essence of cowardice. The ugly truth was exposed that his closest aide, Peter Mandelson, was tied to Jeffrey Epstein, the worst underage sex trafficker in history. Facing a crisis that could collapse his government, Starmer initially seemed to stick to the principles by refusing to let the US use British bases for the initial Iran strike. But under US pressure, Starmer quietly backed down. Using defensive purposes as an excuse, he eventually handed over bases like Diego Garcia to the US military. Because he hesitated at first, Trump publicly mocked him in front of the global press, saying, "This is not Winston Churchill that we are dealing with." On the other hand, Germany is trapped in the historical original sin of the Holocaust, wielding a blind double standard. The German government has officially declared that protecting Israel's security in their region of state. Even in the face of tragedy where 165 Iranian children were killed, Germany turned a blind eye, calling Israel and America's preemptive strike legitimate defense. Yet, when German citizens tried to show solidarity with the Middle Eastern people who are being massacred by German-made weapons, the government violently cracks down on them, immediately slapping them with the scarlet letter of anti-Semitism. To wash away their past guilt, they strictly silence voices about the ongoing massacre in other countries. Meanwhile, they sell massive amounts of weapons to Israel and blindly submit to hegemony. It is completely contradictory. Then we have French President Macron. He shows his nature by using this massive chaos strictly for his own country's hegemony. He avoids becoming a target of US retaliation, unlike the UK. But he still puts his name on the joint statement with the UK and Germany, walking a tightrope to avoid upsetting the US. Furthermore, using Trump's unpredictable America First policy as an excuse, he claims Europe can no longer trust the US nuclear umbrella. He argues for European strategic autonomy, revealing his desire for hegemony by modernizing France's nuclear weapons and expanding military influence. On the other hand, they loudly preach the value of human rights and alliances. But to these Western empires, peace in the Middle East or the lives of innocent children never mattered in the first place. It is simply a bloody dance of survivor. They only want to escape political crisis, make money from weapons, and keep their hegemony using nuclear power. The submission of these three Western European countries sharply contrasts with the firm action of Spain, a fellow Western ally that also shares bases with the US military. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez directly condemned the US and Israel's airstrikes, calling them an unjustified and dangerous military intervention that violates international law. Going even further, he firmly rejected the US request to use Spain's bases for attacking Iran. The Spanish foreign minister officially stated, "We will not allow bases under our sovereignty to be used for any operation that goes against the UN Charter." Because of Spain's firm exercise of sovereignty, 15 US military aircraft refueling tankers waiting for the operation had to abandon their mission, turning back to bases in Germany. Infuriated by this firm refusal, US President Donald Trump officially threatened Spain on March 3rd, saying he would cut off all trade with Spain completely. But Prime Minister Sanchez addressed his nation, saying, "We cannot be accomplices to a war that harms the world out of fear of retaliation. We are willing to accept all political and economic consequences of this decision." He hit right back at the empire's threat. Currently, within the EU and NATO, no other country is standing up against America's illegal war as clear as Spain is. Even major Western media outlets are calling Spain the absolute maverick of Europe. While leaders in Berlin, Paris, and London mechanically agree with the US hegemony, Spain stands alone asking, if they are wrong, why must we blindly stand with them? Facing fierce US pressure and economic threats, the Spanish Prime Minister locked the gates and saying, "We will never join a war without a cause." He showed how a sovereign nation can stick to its principles and truly protect its citizens' safety, even against the logic of a superpower. Spain might look like a lonely maverick right in the middle of Western allies. But if you look beyond the West, the strong matrix built by mainstream US media is already cracking and breaking all over the world. The US claims that the international community condemns Iran, but the international community they talk about is just a few establishment countries like the UK or blindly loyal Germany who are constantly working on eggshells around the US. In reality, a massive solidarity of anger and resistance against the empire's arrogance has already cleared form, mainly around the global south. The pushback from Latin America, which has long been treated as America's backyard, is a prime example. Latin American leaders like Lula da Silva of Brazil, Gustavo Petro of Colombia, and Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico, strongly criticized both the sudden arrest of Venezuela Maduro's in January and the recent bombing of Iran. They slammed the US, saying America has returned to the darkest, most horrific era of imperialism, where they trample on international law. South Africa, which has acted as a moral compass by taking Israel to the International Court of Justice since the Gaza massacres, is also strongly condemning the double standards of superpowers and gathering voices of resistance. Adding to this is Ireland, a European country that historically suffered from imperialist oppression. Regarding the massacre of the 165 girls at primary school in Iran, Ireland blasted the silent European powers, saying, dropping a bomb on a school is not defense. It is a horrific crime of aggression. The most fatal fact is that this massive pushback is not just limited to the global south. Even core allies are turning away, but someone else was secretly fearing this disaster just for their own greed. That is the Saudi Arabia royal family. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, publicly stated, "We want diplomatic peace." However, a recent Washington Post article revealed the truth. MBS, along with his brother, Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman, made several private phone calls to Trump. They persistently lobbied for the bombing, saying, if we don't strike now, Iran will become even more dangerous later. It was a lobbying effort to take control of Middle Eastern hegemony by borrowing American soul without getting a single drop of blood on their own hands. This shows the true face of power, leaders who care nothing for the safety of their people, moving only for their own ego. Especially the deception of the Saudi royal family hit rock bottom in the Epstein files that shocked the world. The so-called guardians of Islam's holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, were exposed for keeping tight relationships with Jeffrey Epstein. MBS gifted Epstein a luxury tent lined with high-end carpets. Text messages showing the royal chief advisor, Rupert R. Savag, exchanging sexual jokes with Epstein were also revealed. A fake Austrian passport found in Epstein's secret safe openly listed his residence as Saudi Arabia. The Saudi royal family even gave pieces of kiswa, the holiest Islamic relic, as souvenir to a convicted child sex trafficker. On the other side, they control their people with strict laws and oppress women. But behind the closed door, using money and power, these rulers built an international crime cartel of pedophilia and human trafficking. To them, religion, ideology, and the value of alliances are just a tool to brainwash the public. In the end, the price of this whack-the-dog tactic is paid entirely with the blood of the weak. Extremely angered by the deceptive triangle alliance of the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, who secretly ordered bombings, Iran finally turned its blade of retaliation toward the entire Gulf region. Iranian suicide drones started raining down on US bases in neighbors countries and oil infrastructure. The secret deal of superpowers have eventually pushed the entire Middle East into a fierce sea of fire. Watching this horrifying chain reaction, some independent journalists and investigative media who don't fall for security framing parroted by mainstream media are not hesitating to call this tragedy in the Middle East the Epstein War. They say it is a deception. A war where powerful leaders colluded to drop missiles on other countries' lands and send their own soldiers to their death just to cover up the disgrace of a global sex trafficking cartel deeply involving the leaders of the US, Europe, and the Saudi royal family. They wear the grand masks of religion and ideology, but the core truth is just a slaughter by the powerful trying to cover up their dirty crime lists with the smell of foreign blood and gunpowder. The problem is that the bill for these secret deals and geopolitical fire play is always paid with the blood of the most powerless and young. Starting with a tragedy in Minov, where 165 Iranian primary schoolgirls died from missiles, and at least 1,045 Iranians have lost their lives so far. The number is gonna get up. And now the US Central Command has officially announced their own bloody price. 6 US soldiers killed in action and 18 severe wounded as of March 5th, 2026. This catastrophe is never going to stay only in the Middle East. An all-around domino effect has begun. With Oman's desperate attempts to mediate a final nuclear deal failing, neighboring Turkey has activated an emergency plan, deploying massive troops to its border to stop a gigantic refugee crisis. Furious, Iran is playing the Hormuz Strait card, the chokehold of the global economy. The fear of global inflation, which will threaten our daily food price and survival, is right at our throats. But for us living in South Korea, what threatens our daily lives is the security crisis in East Asia created by this power vacuum. With America completely distracted by the Middle East, Russia and China are taking advantage of this gap. Russia is threatening the European countries that defend the US and Israel's attack on Iran. China could attack Taiwan at any moment. If US troops stationed in Korea and Japan get into a conflict with the Chinese military, China won't attack the US mainland. Just like Iran, they will first attack South Korea where US military bases and facilities are located. Facing threats from the Middle East and China, Japan's Takaichi government says they can't trust the UN anymore. Under America's protection, Japan found the perfect excuse. They are changing their peace constitution to become a military superpower again. In the middle of all this, South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung has always empathized. Rather than a peace won by fighting and winning, creating a state where there is no need to fight at all is true security and the best peace. Western leaders throw away the safety of their citizens and hide behind the horrific shield Cold War. Japan uses anxiety as a hostage to push for rearmament. But unlike them, the survivor of the Korean Peninsula, sitting on a geopolitical fault line, depends on maintaining a strict balance so we don't get swept into the vortex of the massive proxy war. In the proxy wars of superpowers, the daily lives of ordinary citizens are pushed onto thin ice that could break at any moment. What we desperately need right now is not a victory won by bleeding. It is a peace where we don't need to fight to protect our ordinary today. People define Donald Trump as the absolute evil and the mutant who ruined American democracy. But actually, Trump is not the cause of America. He is the inevitable result. He is simply the physical manifestation of the desire and selfishness that Americans secretly wanted and hoped for. In the past, they hid or packaged their hegemonic desires with sophisticated diplomatic words. Now they just proudly show it raw. That is the only difference. There is a saying every nation gets the government it deserves. America endlessly starts wars in other countries, but they enjoy the geopolitical blessings of never having a single bomb drop on their own mainland. The missiles they fire and the retaliatory missiles flying towards them always land on another country's soil, spilling only the blood of innocent people. When I talk with my friends born and raised in the US, this disconnect becomes even clearer. They always say to me, I didn't vote for Trump, or the problem is that MAGA supporters are uneducated. They are evil. They strictly separate themselves from the problematic America. But from an outsider's perspective, they are all just the same Americans who enabled this horrific resort. So I asked them this. It was the same in South Korea. More than half of the citizens didn't vote for the president who declared the December 3rd martial law. But the Korean people gathered in the square and protested every single day to judge the regime and change the regime we didn't want. Because as citizens, we all felt responsible for our country. What exactly are you guys doing now? The answer I get are always just passive habits. Oh, Congress will keep him in check. Or we can judge him in the midterm election. Answers relying entirely on that broken system they always complain about. Mega supporters are at least understandable because of their transparency. But these people criticize the crisis of democracy in America. They know innocent citizens of other countries are dying from American violence. Yet they are completely unwilling to sacrifice even a tiny bit of their own comfortable lives. Behind this bystander attitude, I think there is a unique disconnection and fragility in American society. First, Americans strongly tend to otherize groups with different political views. They literally treat them as a different species. It reminds me of the line from the movie Civil War. What kind of American are you? Unlike Korea, where people ultimately feel a sense of shared destiny as one Korean people, even if their politics differ, Americans rarely have that feeling. Second, physical and physiological distance kills political action. Because of their vast territory, the power in Washington, D.C. feels disconnected from their daily lives. Their sense of sovereignty, the feeling that they are the master of their country, is also weak. Most importantly, America has a short history and strong individualism. So they have never experienced fighting together as a one nation. They act tough, but inside they are endlessly fragile. They have become members of a spoiled society who feel extreme loss when the social system cracks. At first, I wondered why the citizens of this massive empire were so helpless. But looking into its inner structure, I get a sense of deja vu. Right now, the US government is crossing the line of common sense. They are running wild so extremely and in every direction. So, for ordinary individuals, they don't even know where or how to start fixing it. They are in a state of collective paralysis. On top of that, the Democratic Party is total mess and completely incompetent. The entire American society is basically trapped on an express train to hell with broken brakes. This reminds me the helplessness of German citizens right before World War II watching Hitler and Nazi Party run wild. Hitler also initially gained power through legal elections with public support. But when he used the emergency as excuses to dismantle the state system in a flash, German citizens also lost their sense of direction and stayed silent in the face of overwhelming extremism and the collapse of the opposition. Them back then, just like Americans today, probably put their hopes in a hollow system. But there is one difference. We already learned from history what the end of that catastrophe looks like. And yet, America in 2026 is following the exact same track of that failed history without a single error. It is incredibly arrogant for a country that can't even fix its own government to believe they can easily change the regime of a sovereign nation with just a few missiles. Many Americans ignore outside criticism, saying, "What do you guys know about America? Oh, you know nothing about America. Shut up." Is that really true? They call themselves the number one citizens of the world, but all the information in this world is equally open to everyone, even about America. Think about it. An American who has never traveled abroad, has zero contact with foreigners, and watches only one news channel, versus an outsider with rich global experience who reads and debates multiple sources, including Western, Middle Eastern, and Asian perspectives. Between those two, who can see America more objectively? They shut their ears to the word with their America First arrogance. In the end, this will only choke them. Right now, only Americans don't know this obvious truth. Everything is karma in the end. It is 2026. Only 2 months have passed since the new year, but the world is already a living hell. In January, the US launched a surprise arrest of Venezuela's Maduro. In February, the ruthless immigrant crackdown by ICE shocked the world. And with the start of March, they joined forces with Israel to start a full-scale war with Iran. I feel an exhaustion, as if it's already November or December. The US and the West tolerated Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and they turned a blind eye to Israel's massacre in Gaza. The karma of that silence has created a lawless world. Now they trample on independent nations and backstab Iran during negotiations. With this broken moral dam, if China invades Taiwan tomorrow, or Russia expands its territory further into Eastern Europe, who can stop them and with what justification? Moving forward, the world will fall deeper into the swamp of Islamophobia, refugee crisis, anti-immigrant hate, and racism. And the era of violence will only point at the horizontal weak, not the vertical rulers. Even if more children are sacrificed and everyday hate crimes and mass shooting rain down, 2026 will simply be remembered as the year the war killing humans with AI officially began. It will be recorded as the year of savagery that learned nothing from history. We seem to have learned nothing from the 911 attacks. Here, we need to recall a phone call in 2019 between former President Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump. At that time, Trump called Carter and honestly confessed his anxiety. "I'm worried because China is getting too far ahead of the US in many areas." Carter replied like this: The US is the most warlike nation in the history of the world. In 242-year history, we have only enjoyed 16 years of peace. While America wasted $3 trillion on war and destruction, China hasn't wasted a single cent on war since normalizing relations in 1979. They invested all that money into high-speed railways, infrastructure, and education. That is why they are getting ahead of us. Ironically, whenever China releases a sharp statement against the US these days, they regularly quote this exact wake-up call from former President Carter. An empire that sacrifices its own people and wealth for war instead of peace. An arrogant empire that believes it can change other countries' regimes however it wants. That foolish karma of destruction is now choking all of us. In the face of the endless repeating greed and savagery of the boomer generation and the hypocrisy of powerful Western white men, it is completely natural for ordinary individuals, including millennials and Gen Z, to feel deep helplessness and fear. It reminds me of the hit BBC drama Years and Years, which predicted the reality we are facing now. Surprisingly, this drama predicted Trump's re-election in 2019. It is a black comedy series that foresaw all our current geopolitical crises. In the show, Donald Trump suddenly firing a nuclear missile at a Chinese artificial island near the end of his term, Putin's hegemonic ambitions in Eastern Europe, and the unstoppable global refugee and immigrant crisis sparked by these events. It goes even further. It portrays the legal tyranny of far-right populist regimes, the collapse of the middle class due to bank runs, the side effects of AI technology, and the horrors of refugee camps where minorities are locked up and neglected. It shows it more realistically than reality itself. After experiencing all these horrifying catastrophes, the family sits around the dinner table. They blame the government, the banks, the economy, and the superpowers, crushing the misfortune of their era. But Muriel, the grandma and the elder of the family, points out the real truth. She says the root cause of this hell is not some grand evil conspiracy. It is because of the small selfish habits of ordinary, seemingly good individuals. Muriel says this: don't blame the bankers, don't blame the politicians. It's our fault. This is the world we built. We looked at a cheap 1-pound t-shirt. We knew it came from the bone-crushing exploitation of a worker on the other side of the world. But we just kept quiet and opened our wallets because it was cheap and easy. When automated checkout machines first appeared in supermarkets, we didn't protest or walk out of the store. We didn't want the awkwardness of making eye contact with a female cashier making less minimum wage than us. For that shallow convenience, we gladly stood by while workers were kicked out and jobs disappeared. This massive hell is eventually complete because all our small acts of turning a blind eye gathered together. Closing our eyes and turning away from reality because it is scary and overwhelming. That is also quietly agreeing with the violence of the horrific system. They are superpowers, so it can't be helped. They are America, so it's okay if they break international law a little. If we apply different standards to the strong and the weak, if we close our eyes to the evil of the strong and become more cruel to the weak, if we judge the weight of the white person's life and a Middle Eastern people's life based on values and ideologies, then we become accomplices too. Let's think back just this past January. US Special Forces bombed the capital of Venezuela and launched a special arrest of the sovereign leader Maduro in the middle of the night, dragging him to New York. Those people who clapped blindly, drunk on the Hollywood hero narrative of punishing a dictator. How much do they care about the reality of the Venezuelan people are facing now, just 2 months later? Cross-checking with the latest news, Venezuela in March 2026 now is definitely not a democratized country. In the seat they kicked Maduro out of, the US placed his closest aides, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, an equally corrupt politician, as the acting power. They basically joined hands with a corrupt regime that is practically Maduro again. Leaving the roots of dictatorship completely intact, the US immediately lifted oil sanctions and only secured control over tens of millions of barrels of oil. They are strictly feeding their own greed. America's grand justification for invading a sovereign nation, democracy, and human rights for the Venezuelan people was just a deceptive show to steal another country's resources. America is experiencing extreme political division because they can't even manage a peaceful, common sense transfer of power in their own country. For them to believe they can change a sovereign nation's regime however they want with a few missiles and special forces is an arrogance deeply rooted in white supremacy and Western-centrism. Furthermore, talking about the same kind of armed regime change against Iran, a country with thousands of years of massive history, unique culture, and solid traditions, is a foolish and violent idea. It shows they understand absolutely nothing about the complex and proud emotions and nationalism of the Persian people. Western media arrogantly frames that US and Israel bombers will bring liberation. But behind the frame, the tragic survivor dilemma of the ordinary people who actually live on Iranian soil is completely hidden. Unlike the diaspora who escaped from Iran to save Western society long ago, for the people left inside Iran, this war is not about ideology, it is about survivor. Recently, a young Iranian who introduced himself as born and raised in Iran left this comment on the YouTube channel of a geopolitical analyst, Cyprus Jansen. We are trapped in a house we hate, but we fear the fire around the house even more. Most Iranian people despise the corrupt Islamic theocracies, but they are much more terrified of the country itself collapsing due to Western military intervention. Because over the past decades, they have watched the horrors that US intervention created in other Middle Eastern countries like Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan. They were all promised freedom, but they ultimately fell into chaos, civil war, and foreign occupation. Iranian people don't have the naive belief that bombs from foreign powers will deliver peaceful democracy. Iranian people are highly educated and smart. They are so bright people that young Iranians say, Under a bad government, at least we can survive, but under anarchy, we cannot survive. The reason we must not ignore their desperate dilemma is because the bloody karma left by superpower interventions perfectly overlaps with the painful history of the Korean Peninsula. Passing through the darkness of Japanese colonial rule and suffering the horrific Korean War, what entered this land under the protection of the US military government was not a true democratic government for the people. It was the pro-US dictator Lee Seung-man regime, which strictly served America's hegemonic interests. The power implanted by the West used the strong ideology of anti-communism to split our people in half, deepening isolation and conflict. The Lee Seung-man regime brutally murdered countless innocent people, including the April 3rd Jeju massacre. I highly recommend the book We Do Not Apart by Han Gang, who won the Nobel Literature Prize 2 years ago. We already have it carved into our historical trauma, how horrific a bloody price the illusion that foreign power will save us demands. This is exactly why we must no longer be fooled by the deceptive frames produced daily by the collaboration of the Western world and white elite mainstream media. Now we must intentionally and desperately escape from the biased Western-centric mindset that has dominated our brains for so long. It is time to reject the flat narratives spoon-fed by mainstream media. We must acquire balanced information through strict cross-checking and make fully independent thoughts and judgment. Especially now in the AI era, where the massive knowledge and data of the earth are open. The cowardly excuse of, oh, I didn't know the truth because I couldn't access information, no longer works. The hidden side of global politics and fragments of facts are already placed equally at our fingertips. But remember one thing. AI holds vast information, but it has no intention to uncover the truth and no will to get angry and resist injustice. To tear down the curtains of this absurd world, what kind of sharp questions we ask AI and what hidden truth we pull out is entirely up to the lonely and fierce effort of each individual. The moment we give up asking questions, we simply become slaves again to the algorithm and systems of power designed by someone else. What the old greedy leaders fear the most is an awakened gaze and the recording of the truth. Standing against the violence that tries to erase other people's pain as collateral damage. Facing the savagery of our era straight up. Asking questions toward the truth and standing in solidarity with the pain of the weak, that is the most dignified resistance. We who have fallen into the swamp of helplessness can throw at the word. Right there, where the Western matrix has shattered into pieces, we must fiercely question the karma of this empire. This has been Hana's Island. If you like my video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Please everyone be safe. Stay strong. Welcome to Hana's Island. You are safe here now. Take care. Bye.